want to talk a little bit about the rise of the study of society and why sociology is even a discipline that you are studying today. That's part of the curriculum for humanities and the social sciences. So, a couple of things were happening in society that caused people to question, like, hey, what's going on? What's taking place? One of these things is there was a rise of a factory-based economy. Society was changing from a largely agrarian economy to a factory-based economy. And because of this, there was also explosive growth of cities. And when I'm talking about explosive growth of cities, I'm talking about in 1800, there were only 900,000 people living in London, but then within the next 100 years, by the year 1900, the population of London was 4.7 million. We see similar changes happening in Paris that goes from 600,000 people to 3 million people, and Berlin that goes from 170,000 people in 1800 to 2.7 million people by the year 1900. So we're seeing a change in the way that goods and services are created and distributed. We're seeing a change in the way that people are living. And both of these changes have to do with industrialization. This industrial revolution is kind of the catalyst behind these changes. And these changes make people question, hey, what's going on? What's happening? What's going to happen? And these changes we might, be familiar with and understand, but at the time they were a large disruption to how people had previously lived. They also brought a lot of problems. So, for example, an excerpt from a sociologist looking at what's happening in Europe during these changes described the scene as in big cities, the death rate had reached such levels that by the middle of the 19th century, there was serious doubts whether sufficient hands would be available for factories and whether enough able-bodied recruits would be found for the armies. The big city slums represented reservoirs of infectious diseases and epidemics, menacing not only the poor, but the life and health of the upper classes as well. So there's so many people, and they're bringing diseases, and they're bringing dirt and grime and sewage people are a little disconcerted with this, and they're starting to wonder what's happening, and they want to know what's happening so they can make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. Another change that we're starting to see is that there are new ideas about democracy and political rights. And a lot of this is coming from both France and the United States at the time. So these changes are disrupting people's ways of life, and they're starting to make them question what's happening, ask questions about what's happening in society so they can understand it and make predictions about the future. These things underlie the kinds of questions that brought about the study of sociology. So, this week we're going to look at theories and theoretical perspectives, and it all starts with this guy over here on the right, Auguste Comte. Comte was one of the first thinkers around sociology that started to question what's happening in the social world. And he thought that, people could study the social world a lot like they studied the physical world. And he wanted to find these social facts or these laws that governed the social world. Now, the problem with Comte is that unlike the physical world, we have, laws of gravity and inertia. These same sort of laws don't necessarily govern the social world. As you've read about with chapter 1, people have agency. So while we can make predictions about trends, there is nothing that's absolute. We'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 2. Comte, nonetheless, remains an important figure in sociology, mostly because he coined the term sociology in 1832, and also because he encouraged studying the social world in a scientific way through empirical evidence, making predictions, and verifying those predictions with scientific research. When we look at sociology, there are three main theoretical perspectives that are going to be introduced this week, but are going to carry on throughout this course. We consider these theoretical approaches ways of thinking or theoretical umbrellas, and I want to introduce them a little bit more to you, build upon what you've read in chapter 1. We've got structural functionalism, conflict theory, and lastly, symbolic interactionalism. So let's start with structural functionalism. So, when we're looking at structural functionalism, it starts with this man, Emile Durkheim. Now, Durkheim was from France, so was Comte, and Durkheim is responsible for establishing sociology as an academic discipline. It's the reason you're taking a sociology class right now. Durkheim was really interested in social bonds in society. Now, a little fact that's important, I think, about Durkheim is Durkheim lived a very upper class lifestyle where it was his job to study, to be in academia. He wasn't working in one of these grimy factories where people were losing their lives every day. And this impacted the way that he looked at the social world. He had a very positive view of the social world. And what he thought is that people were inherently individualistic and they really needed society to hold them together. So he's interested in these social bonds, what holds people together. He was interested in this concept of solidarity, right? This idea that people are bonded together in society. And he thought that as society changed, they still had social bonds, just the bonds that were holding them together changed. And so he observed that as society is going from largely agrarian to largely manufacturing factory work, that people are changing their bonds. In agrarian societies, small, close knit communities, people are kind of bonded together by shared ways of life and shared traditions and shared beliefs. But now that people are living in large cities with all sorts of people from different walks of life and different places and different jobs and different social classes, they don't have shared traditions and beliefs anymore, but rather their bonds come from a need for interdependence that, you know, they're reliant on the other people around them. And if you think about it, in our society today, we continue to have these types of bonds. You and I are bonded together because we are interdependent on one another. I need you all for a job, and you need me for a credential on your way to receiving that certificate of education. Durkheim also was concerned about this concept of anomie, this idea that when social bonds break down, chaos erupts, right? Or normlessness, this loss of norms, this loss of shared ways of understanding the world and expectations in the world. So Durkheim thought that bonds were so important that they prevented anomie. And one way he studied this was by looking at suicide. He wanted to study suicide because he took something that was one of the most individualistic of actions and he related it to social factors. So, what he did was he looked at who was committing suicide and what social categories they fit into, and found that there was a trend in the social categories of the people that committed suicide. He looked at those people based upon their social class. He looked at people committing suicide based upon their gender. He looked at suicide based upon their religion and found that some social classes and some genders and some religions were either more likely or less likely to commit suicide. And from this, he theorized that it was actually the bonds in society influencing suicide rates. Now, what's interesting about Durkheim's research on suicide is that his observations and theories still hold true today in terms of looking at statistics on suicide. Just a small example from that is he found that women were less likely to commit suicide than men. Today, we still find those numbers to be true. And when we look at gendered expectations between women and men, we as society provide a lot more outlets and opportunities for women to share and communicate, to bond, to reach out, to be emotionally um, vulnerable than we necessarily do men. And therefore, when women experience problems, they're much more likely to reach out and get help and seek help, whereas men are more likely to be isolated and to engage in drug and alcohol abuse. Now, Durkheim's theories and ideas form the basis of structural functionalism, which looks at society as an ordered system of interrelated parts, and that these parts perform specific functions for society as a whole. Again, a very positive outlook on society, that society is made up of these parts, and these parts work together. They work together to maintain stability and solidarity in society. Kind of like the human body, right? You've got your respiratory system and your nervous system, your muscular system, your skeletal system, your endocrine system, digestive system, reproduction system. We've got all these different systems and they all perform a specific function, but we actually need all these systems working together in society to make our body function properly. Or we could think about it in the gears of a clock, right? As one gear turns, it turns another gear, which turns another gear, which turns another gear. And we need all these gears working together to make the clock work. And that's how functionalism looks at society, is these different parts that are working together, and as they all work together, they help society function. Now, structural functionalism is a macro level theory. It's going to look at these larger social structures in society. So it's going to say the economy performs a certain role for society, and education performs a certain role for society, and religion performs a certain role for society. And we need all these different structures to perform their roles so that they all can function together. We don't necessarily expect the economy to teach us to pee in the toilet and not in the bed. That's the role of the family, right? Or that our underwear go under our pants and not over our pants. That's not something we necessarily expect the education system to teach us, but rather our family to teach us. But we need these different structures performing their specific functions. Now, another structural functionalist was Merton, and Merton looked at functions based upon whether they were manifest functions or latent functions, right? Manifest functions he identified as those intended functions of the structures, latent functions being unintended functions or purposes or roles that the structures performed. What's very important to remember here is structural functionalists are almost always positive about the way that they look at the functions of structures in society. So latent functions are going to be positive things, even though they're unintended. For example, education. If we look at education, we could say the manifest function of education, the intended function or intended purpose of education is to give students skills and knowledge that they need so that they can join the workforce and earn a living, right? That's the reason that you are probably taking this college course. You want to get that degree so that you can take the skills and the knowledge that you have gained in college to the workforce where you will earn a higher income. A latent function of education might be meeting a partner or even a spouse in education. I imagine you didn't sign up for the sociology course to find a partner, but could it happen? Does it happen? Absolutely. Merton also recognized that sometimes structures perform dysfunctions. Sometimes structures disrupt the operation of society. Sometimes education doesn't work the way that it was intended to work. And we can look at the high cost of tuition. Right? If we look at education today, it's pretty expensive to go to college. And so what we see is that education is not something that's available to all students, creating divisions and divides in society. We might call that a dysfunction of education, the high price of tuition. Now, another theoretical perspective starts with this gentleman, Karl Marx. Karl Marx was German. He actually was exiled from Germany. He didn't have that cushy lifestyle, we might say, that Durkheim had. He actually was an outsider in society, experienced a lot of criticisms in society, hardship in society, and that's going to impact his outlook. Marx tends to be associated with communism. I will tell you, though, if Marx was alive today, he would say how we've seen communism play out in the world isn't necessarily how he would have theorized about communism. But nonetheless, he started theorizing about an idea of communism and therefore is connected to it. Marx was quite critical of capitalism. He thought that capitalism created two classes of people, the bourgeoisie, or the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, or the workers, right? Those people that sold their labor for wages. Marx was critical of capitalism because he thought that as the bourgeoisie followed their own self-interest and as the proletariat followed their own self-interest, this would lead to class conflict. The bourgeoisie, they wanted to make more money, right? So did the proletariat. But the way that the bourgeoisie were going to make more money was by continuing to exploit the proletariat, right? And the way that the proletariat were going to make more money was to make the system more equal for them. Now, Marx certainly identified more with the proletariat, right? He wrote articles calling to the proletariat to recognize what he called their class consciousness, to recognize the exploited position he felt that they were in within this capitalist economic system and to seek change within it. We have to remember that Marx is theorizing in the latter part of the 19th century. There wasn't a 40-hour work week, there wasn't overtime pay, there were no safety standards or labor unions, minimum wage, anything like that. So the working conditions were really pretty poor for workers at the time. So Marx says that society is essentially divided between these two classes, and each class seeks their own self-interest. They are in conflict with one another, and he is calling for a change in this system to become more equal. His theories and ideas surrounding capitalism have given way to conflict theory. Conflict theory sees social conflict over resources and power as the basis of society, that society is divided so that one group of people has greater access to power and resources, and another group of people is denied access to the same set of power and resources. Now, some people are concerned that conflict theory is pretty negative and depressing because it focuses on that how society is divided and how society is unequal. But the reason that conflict theorists want to look at these inequalities of society is to make change, right? The idea that they have to understand the inequalities of society to make society more equal. Feminist theory kind of falls under a conflict theory theoretical approach because it's looking at inequality in society, but specifically as it involves gender, right? It emphasizes the centrality of gender and analyzing the social world, particularly focusing on the experiences of women and the ideas that women have been left out. You know, if you look through all the theorists mentioned in your book, we only have one woman, and she's under the section of neglected theorists. So women were studied historically from a male perspective and have been left out of much of the history of society in general and sociology as well. So feminist theory emerged to capture those experiences of women and to understand the world from a woman-centered perspective, which has historically been an exploited, disenfranchised perspective. Next, we have Max Weber. Now, we have to remember that Max Weber is German, so that W is pronounced like a V, not a W. Max Weber was very concerned about this concept of rationalization, this application of economic logic to everyday life. He was particularly interested in bureaucracies. We're going to talk more about that later in the semester when we talk about groups and organizations. And he thought that rationalization was something that was quite intriguing. It led to greater efficiency in society, but he was also concerned that it led to disenchantment in society as well. That almost any organization we look at in society is a bureaucratic organization. There are a set of rules and structures that govern the organization that are much more important or become more important than the people that actually make up and operate that bureaucratic organization. And this is disenchanting to people. It's dehumanizing to people. Just to give you a really quick, easy illustration of how this might work is to compare these two things. Ooey gooey, extra cheesy macaroni and cheese. Maybe this isn't appetizing to you, but certainly you can think of some sort of recipe, perhaps in your family or something that you make that's homemade, or in somebody's house that you go into and they have this specialty dish that they make better than anybody else. And as soon as you walk in, you're engulfed in that smell and your mouth starts watering and you bite into it. Not only are you tasting all the yummy ingredients, but you're tasting that little bit of love that was baked into that meal. Right? Are you getting hungry now? Compare that to something like Easy Mac. You add a little water, you pop it in the microwave for a couple minutes, and sure, you get a meal that provides you with some calories, right? Takes care of that hunger you've been suffering from. But isn't there quite a difference between these two meals in taste, but also in experience? One we might experience with others, and one we might experience by ourselves. And so, what Weber's getting at is that we lose a little bit of ourselves when we focus on efficiency. Easy Max, super efficient. 2 minutes and you have a meal. It's going to take much longer to make this kind of ooey gooey, extra cheesy meal there on the right that's homemade. But the experience of eating and the taste and the quality are going to be much better. Weber says we're so concerned about rationalization and efficiency, though, that we're compromising those things. And his argument that this is leading to disenchantment. This is leading to dehumanization. Another thing that Weber is remembered for and noticed for is this concept of Verstehen, which is a German word that means to understand truly objectively. And we'll talk more about this when we get to chapter 2. But Weber thought that we should look at the social world and see not what we see from our own perspective, but to see what is truly there, to capture what's there in an objective way. And so Weber's thinking is very important to symbolic interactionalism, which is going to understand what's happening in society, the interactions with people, but also studying society in an objective way. More we'll talk about in chapter 2. Lastly, symbolic interactionalism. Now, George Herbert Mead, who will talk more when we talk about social interactionism or social interaction in the semester, is the sociologist, actually an American sociologist connected to symbolic interactionalism. He was coming out of the Chicago School in the early 1900s. Symbolic interactionalism is different from both structural functionalism and conflict theory because those two theories are macro level theories focusing on larger social structures and how they influence individuals, whereas symbolic interactionalism is focused on the individual interactions between people. Symbolic interactionalism sees interaction and meaning as central to society, and meanings that's created through interaction. So the idea in symbolic interactionalism is nothing inherently has meaning, but rather meanings are created as we interact. So for example, as an individual holds up their hands, making a little heart, that doesn't inherently mean anything, but yet we give this simple meaning and respond and react to it. And as we respond and react to it, meaning is created. A tree. Do we see this tree as a place that provides shade from the sun, a cool and comfortable place to sit and relax? Or do we see this tree as a place that harbors bugs that might be gross and dangerous to us, right? That would lead us to run from it as far as we can. There is no inherent meaning in this tree. Rather, we give this tree meaning depending on the way we interact with it. Do we sit under it in its shade, or do we run away from it as far as we can, screaming? By interacting with it, we give meaning to the tree. So again, meanings are created, and they're created through interactions. This is going to be a micro level theory. It's focusing on individual interaction. It's focusing on what people do, not the larger social structures that govern them. Another way we can look at meanings in society come from the very recent school board meetings in Albemarle County Schools, contesting the wearing of any Confederate flag clothing. On one hand, we have individuals holding up this sign, racists don't get reelected, arguing that the Confederate flag is a symbol that is racist, a symbol that is harmful to students, a symbol that causes distress. And on the other hand, we have individuals that see the symbol of a Confederate flag in a very different way, a Confederate flag that is not offensive, that represents history, a Confederate flag that should be protected and presumably allowed in schools. So, again, the idea is that this symbol doesn't inherently have one meaning. Rather, the meaning changes depending on the audience and is communicated in different ways and can be understood in different ways as well. So, we've got three theoretical perspectives: structural functionalism, that is contributed to by Durkheim, conflict theory contributed to by Marx, and symbolic interactionalism contributed to by Mead. Two are macro level theories, one is a micro level theory. And we'll continue to come back to these theories as we discuss and engage in analysis of other social institutions and social structures in society.